This is a copy of the sermon that'll be preached at North Shields Evangelical Church on Sunday, the 14th of July. Before listening to it, please could you read 1 Kings chapter 20, and there's a link below this video to those Bible verses. In 2021, Jans Heining, a Danish artist, demanded £61,000 in physical cash to create a piece of artwork for the Danish Museum. He was employed to create 2 pictures using the physical banknotes, and this is the picture that he put on display. The title of this picture is "Take the Money and Run." Jans Heining demanded a lot, gave nothing back, and deceived everyone. He took the cash and put a blank canvas in the art gallery. He demanded a lot, gave nothing back, and deceived everyone. And we see the same thing happening in chapter 20. In chapter 20, Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad demands everything from Ahab, king of Israel. The 2 of them were at war. Ben-Hadad demands Ahab gives him his wives, his children, and his silver and his gold. And as if that is not enough, he then demands everything in the king's palace and everything in his servant's house as well. Ahab refuses his enemy's demands. He says, "See how this man is looking for trouble." Ahab refuses enemy's demands. But notice what happens later. After God saves Ahab from Ben-Hadad, after God warns Ahab about Ben-Hadad, after God saves Ahab from Ben-Hadad, again, after these events, Ben-Hadad, the enemy, pretends to be Ahab's friend. Verses 31 to 33. Ben-Hadad's servants tied sackcloth around their waists and put ropes on their heads, and went to the king of Israel and said, "Your servant Ben-Hadad says, 'Please let me live.' And he said, 'Does he still live? He is my brother.' Now the men were watching for a sign, and they quickly took it up from him and said, 'Yes, your brother Ben-Hadad.' Then he said, 'Go and bring him up.' And then Ben-Hadad came out to him, and he caused him to come up into the chariot." Let's just rewind a second to make sure that we've heard this right. Ahab becomes best mates with his enemy, who has just threatened to take everything from him. He calls his worst enemy my brother. And what does his new best mate offer him in return? Verse 33. And Ben-Hadad said to Ahab, "The cities that my father took from your father I will restore, and you may establish bazaars for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria." And Ahab said, "I will let you go on these terms." So he made a covenant with him and let him go. Ahab risks everything. He risks everything on a Harry Styles beer mat, 10 mils of essential oil, a hanging cat that you can use as a wind chime. These are all the tasteful items I found on the website of Tynemouth's Raspberry Bazaar. A Harry Styles beer mat, 10 mils of essential oil, a hanging cat wind chime. We read in verse 34 that Ahab was willing to everything for the same type of things. Ahab risked everything because his enemy Ben-Hadad offered him the chance to open his own bazaar, a bazaar that sells useless little trinkets like I've named. Ahab was deceived. He was deceived. He was deceived into thinking that his enemy, who demanded everything, was his best friend. Ahab was deceived into thinking that his enemy would give him great things in return. Now, before we all berate Ahab for his stupidity, I like to suggest that we're all just as easily taken in. Think of some of the things that have wreaked the most havoc in your life. Habits that you now regret forming. Thoughts that got the better of you. Actions you wish that you could undo. Did some of them not start in the same way? It introduced itself as a friend, but turned out to be an enemy. It promised great things, but then robbed you of so much more. Let's examine two small-scale examples of this that are common, I think, to all. Lying. Lying introduces itself as a friend who can get you out of a tight spot, but it takes from you so much more. Lying can take your relationships from you, for how can people trust you again? Lying can take your peace from you, for you never feel easy in the presence of the truth. Lying can take integrity from you. Lying is a gateway drug, a gateway sin. It opens the door to so many more. Hate. Hate introduces itself as a friend who is on your side in your war with your enemies. But hate can also be your worst enemy as well. For example, hate. Hate can take your self-control from you. Hate grows and grows, and it doesn't like the restrictions of the four walls that you try and keep it in, to keep it under control. Hate can take your joy from you. A drop of bitterness can spoil the taste of every pleasure. Hate can take your eyes from you. You cannot see how you could ever be in the wrong, and you cannot see or appreciate concepts like mercy and understanding. Now, I may not have mentioned the thing that is currently wreaking the most havoc in your life at the moment, but the same principle remains true. Every person, each person is tempted, James says. Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. The Bible warns us about another enemy, the enemy of our sinful desires. And, much like Ahab, sin pretends to be our best friend, promises something good, then demands we give up our joy, integrity, and peace. Like Jan's Hanning, who has painted the picture, "Take the money and run," so too sin's only intention in your life is to steal, to kill, and destroy. Contrast this to God. In this passage, God constantly works for Ahab's good. God warns Ahab. In verse 22, afterward the prophet came to the king of Israel and said, "Strengthen your position and see what must be done, because next spring the king of Aram will attack you again." God warns Ahab, but Ahab let his enemy deceive him. God protects the whole nation. A prophet came to Ahab and told him that he would give the enemy's vast army into his hand. God protects the whole nation. But Ahab becomes a friend with the one who intended to strip the nation of all its good people and all its things. Ahab goes on to treat his enemy Ben-Hadad like a best friend. And yet Ahab, who had been an enemy to God had great mercy on Ahab and treated his enemy like a friend. Now a question for you. Who are you listening to more? God, your true friend, or your enemies of sin and the devil, who try and convince you that they are your best friend? So sin demands the lot from us and deceives us all. And sin decreases the gap and deceives us all. The deceptive nature of sin is made blindingly obvious in what followed in chapter 21, which I'm going to read a little bit for us now. Chapter 21 of 1 Kings. Now Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel, beside the palace of Ahab king of Samaria. And after this Ahab said to Naboth, Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, The Lord forbid that I give you the inheritance of my fathers. And Ahab went into his house, vexed and sullen, because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. For he had said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. And he lay down on his bed, and turned away his face, and would eat no food. But Jezebel his wife came to him, and said to him, Why is your spirit so vexed, because you eat no food? And he said to her, Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite, and said to him, Give me your vineyard for money, or else, if it pleases you, I'll give you another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give you my vineyard. And Jezebel his wife said to him, Do you now govern Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she, Jezebel, wrote letters in Ahab's name, and sealed them with his seal. And she sent the letters to the elders and the leaders who lived with Naboth in the city. And she wrote in the letters, Proclaim a fast, and set Naboth at the head of the people. And set 2 worthless men opposite him, and let them bring a charge against him, saying, You have cursed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him to death. And the men of the city, the elders and the leaders who lived in his city, did as Jezebel had sent word to them, as it was written in the letters that she had sent to them. They proclaimed a fast, and set Naboth at the head of the people. And the 2 worthless men came and sat opposite him. And the worthless men brought a charge against Naboth in the presence of the people, saying, Naboth cursed God and the king. So they took him outside the city, and stoned him to death with stones. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, Naboth has been stoned, he is dead. As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead, Jezebel said to Ahab, Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth is not alive, but dead. And as soon as Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab arose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. What did the polar bear say to the penguin? Nothing. The 2 live poles apart. In this passage we see 3 things that should be poles apart. Firstly, a fast, something that is typically part of a religious festival. We see a fast and a murder. In this passage we see elders, those meant to practice and uphold all that is good and right. And we also see worthless men who will stand for the opposite of what's right, for the right price. In this passage we see an organised trial, an organised way of upholding the law. And yet we also see mob violence, taking the law into one's own hands. Each of these should be poles apart. A massive gap should be between them. But in verses 8 to 11, we find them side by side. A fast becomes the scene of a murder. The best of men listen to the worst of men. An organised trial threw truth out the window and turned into a riot. Sin had closed the gap between right and wrong. Sin had closed the gap between right and wrong, and Ahab couldn't discern the one from the other. Ahab was deceived by sin, and so are we. Again, I'll start with some well-known examples to illustrate the point. What is the most dangerous place for an unborn child? Where is the most dangerous place for an unborn child? A war zone, the place where the number of deaths is surely the highest. what should be the safest place for an unborn child? Its own mother's womb. Sadly, abortion has closed the gap. Now, statistically, the most dangerous place for an unborn child is the place where it should be the safest. What is the worst crime that anyone could commit, according to prisoners? If you ask a prisoner which crime is the worst, they will tell you it's child abuse. Every child abuser in Durham prison gets the worst treatment by their fellow prisoners. Who should live the purest and most moral of lives? Christian leaders. Sadly, these two things, child abuse and Christian leaders, have not historically been poles apart. Is it not blindingly obvious? Sin closes the gap between right and wrong. It is blindingly obvious, except when you're the one being deceived. And sin has an exceptionally good track record of being able to deceive every one of us. After reflecting on this, God helped me to see this happening in myself. Last year, there was a specific sin I thought I was poles apart from making. This year, I was not poles apart. On a weekly basis, I teach from the Bible and remind myself of its very humbling message. I really wish I could say I was poles apart from pride. We're all at risk. We're all at risk of committing that sin we thought we were poles apart from making. We're all at risk of becoming forgiven people who delight in condemning others. We're all at risk of making God's own church a place where people feel unwelcome. We're all at risk of holding Christian values that our actions are poles apart from keeping. And we're all at risk. In fact, we're probably all guilty, because sin is exceptionally good at deceiving us all and blinding us all. Thankfully, passages like this open our eyes. They help us see just how deceiving sin can be. And, even more thankfully, this passage ends with surprising hope. Reading from chapter 21, verses 8 to 11. From verses 25 to 26. There was none who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, like Ahab, whom Jezebel his wife enticed. He acted very abominably in going after idols, as the Amorites had done, whom the Lord cast out before the people of Israel. By this time next week in our sermon series, we'll have covered the seventh chapter in the Bible describing Ahab's reign. In his time, Ahab killed hundreds of prophets. Ahab worshipped hundreds of other gods. Ahab was ranked number 1 in the top 100 sinful kings. And yet this is how these events in Ahab's life ends. And when Ahab heard those words, the words of the prophet condemning him for his sin, he tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his flesh, and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went about dejectedly. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the disaster in his days. In chapters 16 to 19, Ahab killed hundreds of prophets. In chapter 21, God sends in Ahab yet another prophet, calling him to repent. In chapter 16 to 19, we've been told that Ahab worshipped hundreds of other gods. In this chapter, the one God that Ahab hadn't worshipped, reaches out to save him. By chapter 21, Ahab has the reputation of being the number 1 sinner. But in these verses, we see that God still offers mercy to the likes of him. This is shocking. You might even take issue with the ending. But think, if everything we've learnt about Ahab is true of us, that we've been deceived by sin, and that we're pulled apart from the type of person we should be. If everything we've learnt about Ahab is true, then surely we should rejoice in this ending. For we are in need of the same mercy as Ahab was shown. It is why we can be thankful. Thankful that this passage reminds us not only that sin deceives us all, but that Christ came down to save us all. We may have rejected our conscience. We may have rejected God's teaching on right and wrong. But we can rejoice that God sent yet another messenger to us. How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he would send his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. We may have turned our back on God, but we can be thankful that, instead of turning his back on us, God turned his back on his only Son. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns his face away, as wounds which mar his only Son bring many like us to glory. We may have done everything to make God our enemy, but God has done everything to make us his friend. Why should I gain from his reward? I cannot give an answer. But this I know with all my heart, his wounds have paid my ransom.